Ever look at a bunch of different bikes and wonder if just like a handful of companies are making all these frames?
Yeah.
I mean, so many bikes out there looking pretty similar, you kind of start to think that maybe they all come from the same place, right?
Right.
Well, today we are taking a deep dive into some reports and some industry analysis to uncover the real story behind, global bicycle frame manufacturing. So get ready for some surprising facts.
Sounds good.
So let's kick things off by tackling this idea that there are only, 8 major bike frame manufacturers out there.
Yeah.
I mean, is it really that simple?
Not really, no. That idea that there's only a few big players, it's really not the whole picture. The reality is it's a lot more diverse. It's kind of a complicated network, really. You take Europe, for instance. You've got these giant companies like Cyclorp AB. They own a ton of different brands. Same with Derby Cycle. And then there's Doral Sports. They're part of Pon Holdings now.
Okay.
They're the ones behind Cannondale Schwinn Mongoose GT.
Oh, wow. Big names.
Yeah, so that's a pretty big chunk of the market, but it's not the whole story.
So it's way beyond just like that little short list we always hear about.
Right.
What about the more like the niche builders?
Yeah.
The smaller companies doing really specialized stuff?
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting. So beyond the big names, you have all these companies doing innovative stuff with carbon fiber.
Oh.
Like Allied Cycle works here in the US, Appleman too. Then you've got Assiduous WI in Italy, Carbonda in Taiwan. They're all really pushing the limits of carbon fiber tech, And it's often driven by like what high performance riders want in those specific areas.
Makes sense.
And then you can't forget about all the custom builders, guys who make frames from scratch with all kinds of materials. You've got Whitson doing titanium, Ficina Battaglan with steel, and then Legend, they work with pretty much everything, aluminum, steel, titanium, you name it. And then you have Argonaut, they focus on custom carbon frames.
Wow, so many options.
Oh, and I almost forgot, a huge number of frames are actually made by OEM suppliers. Yeah. Original equipment manufacturers, so basically they're factories that produce frames for all sorts of brands you might not even know.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, they're kind of behind the scenes.
Okay, so we've got this like much bigger picture now. But what about the big American brands, like the ones we see everywhere?
Right.
Where are they actually making their bikes?
Yeah.
Because I always kind of assumed that, hypothetical brand name was made in hypothetical origin country because of the name.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that. But it's not always the case. So Trek, for example, even though they're an American company, most of their frames are actually made in Taiwan, Cambodia, and China.
Really?
Yeah. But they do some higher-end assembly and limited production here in the U.S. for their Project One program.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then Specialized, they mostly manufacture in Taiwan, too. Giant, which is one of the biggest bike makers in the world. They have their own factories all over Taiwan. China, the Netherlands, or Hungary, and they're even opening one in Vietnam soon.
Wow, they're really global.
Totally.
Yeah.
So yeah, the brand's origin doesn't always tell you where the frame was actually made.
That's fascinating. It makes you wonder, like, how did we even get to this point,
Yeah.
Like this whole globalized manufacturing landscape. Can we kind of trace that history a little bit?
Definitely. If you look back at a company like Schwinn, for example, they were like the kings of American bikes,
Right.
They had their factories, right, in Chicago making those classic models everybody knows.
Yeah.
But to stay competitive, they ended up moving production overseas, first to Japan and Taiwan, working with companies like Panasonic and Giant. And then later on, they shifted to China under different ownership. Mongoose, too.
Oh, yeah.
They started making BMX frames in California. But they went through a bunch of ownership changes, and now they make their bikes overseas as part of Durell/Pon.
Gotcha.
And a big reason for this shift was the rising global competition and the much lower labor costs you find overseas.
So it really comes down to like the economics of it all, huh?
Yeah, in a lot of ways it does. Labor costs in Asia are way lower than places like California, for example.
Right.
And that makes a huge difference when you're trying to keep prices down. And then you have companies like Giant who have these super efficient production hubs in Asia.
Okay.
They can make bikes on a massive scale, and that helps keep costs down too. Plus, there's the fact that a lot of the raw materials for bikes come from Asia, like China is a big producer of carbon fiber, for example.
Right.
So it just makes sense for a lot of companies to manufacture there.
Okay, but what about all these tariffs we keep hearing about on imports?
Yeah.
Have they had an impact on things?
Yeah, they definitely have. The U.S. has put tariffs on bikes and parts coming in from China, especially these things called Section 301 tariffs. And they can add up to a pretty big tax, which makes bikes from China more expensive.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like we've seen it with e-bike prices. They've gone up quite a bit. So because of all this, some companies have started getting their parts and bikes from places like Cambodia and Vietnam to avoid those tariffs.
Makes sense.
And the thing is, nobody's really sure what's going to happen with trade policies in the future.
Right.
So that's a big concern, especially for American companies that still depend on imported parts.
Okay, so let's say we want to see more bike frames made right here in the USA.
Yeah.
What are some of the things we could do to make that happen?
Well, there are a few strategies people are talking about.
Okay.
One idea is to use targeted tariffs that don't hurt American companies that make bike parts.
Uh-huh.
Kind of level the playing field a little bit.
Right.
And then there's things like tax breaks and loans to help American bike makers get started or expand their business.
That sounds helpful.
Yeah. And then another big thing is investing in automation, using technology to make manufacturing more efficient. And research and development is important too, finding new ways to make bikes better and lighter.
Right.
And then there's the whole issue of training people, making sure there are enough skilled workers to build bikes here in the US.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And another strategy is for the industry to work together, promote American-made bikes and focus on those special areas where we can really excel, like custom bikes, high-end bikes, and even industrial bikes.
Okay.
And then sustainability is becoming more and more important, making bikes in a way that's good for the environment. That's something American companies could really focus on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there are definitely ways to make bikes in the U.S. more competitive.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. It's clear that the whole world of bike frame manufacturing is way more complicated than most people realize.
Yeah, it really is.
It's this really interesting mix of global mass production and, dedicated craftsmanship happening right here in the US.
Absolutely.
So for everyone listening, I want to leave you with this question. Take into account all the stuff we talked about today, the economics, the history, the impact of trade policies.
Yeah.
What do you think is the one single factor that will have the biggest impact on where bike frames are made in the next 10 years?
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
It is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.